Hello, my name is Sarah Johns. I am a history major at Ursinus College, and this is a video recording of my TimeMapper project for my research project titled Written Battleground: Indian Soldiers, Colonial Anxieties, and Codes in World War I. I am using this video as a way of adding voiceover to my assignment, specifically to add analysis to the four letters I highlight during the timeline. To outline how I will approach this narration, I will mainly read through what is on the screen, and when necessary, mainly in the case of the letters, I will add narrated analysis where the TimeMap software makes it difficult for me to do so. I also plan on adding analysis or brief description of photos when included. When the letters are discussed, I will also provide a key to the codes used by the soldiers in question next to the letter. This will be done for accessibility, but also so that you as the viewer may scroll through the video, pause, and read through things on the time map yourself if need be. Otherwise, thank you for your time. So before I begin, I would like to say that my main argument and sphere of focus of this assignment was that the sepoy soldiers used the codes within their letters during their time on the Western Front in World War I as a way of exerting personal control and agency over what information they chose to share. This was done in the face of strong colonial anxiety, which I will now begin delving into. So as you can see on my first little location here, the Sepoy Mutiny, which began in 1857, had major implications for the experiences of Indian soldiers on the Western Front during World War I. The discontent and anger that sparked the mutiny itself had roots in the arrival to India of the British East India Company in the 1700s, which was driven by a desire to pursue economic ventures within the region. Yet, the company, which would eventually gain control politically of the region in the mid-1700s, did not have an easy time setting out to attain what they hoped would be an easy source of financial income, as local groups reacted harshly to English colonial encroachment. It would be only a matter of time before violence erupted. In 1857, a rumor began to circulate among troops in the British Indian Army that British officials were importing guns covered in beef and pork fat, both of which went against the religious beliefs of the Army's Hindu and Muslim troops. This was made worse by the fact that the British officials specifically commanded the troops to touch their lips to different components of the guns in order to trigger the events that would fire them. While this is considered a rumor, as little proof can be found to verify whether the British actually did this, it set off a firestorm of anger that resulted in the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. The mutiny was a nearly year-long event that succeeded in garnering the support of local groups who were also frustrated with British rule in India, making it a long and difficult fight that the British had a very difficult time winning. Eventually, however, the Indian soldiers would lose, and Queen Victoria would respond by making India an official English colony in 1848 to compensate for poor company control in the region. This event would also trigger a restructuring of the British Indian Army, inspiring British military officials to create a new martial race that idealized poor peasant farmers from the Punjab and Northwest frontier territories. Such soldiers, who would make up a great deal of those fighting on the Western Front in World War I, were uneducated and therefore seen by the British as less likely to rebel. All right, so the photo included is an art piece titled "The Troops of Native Allies," which was created in 1857 and depicts the support of local people in response to the Sepoy Mutiny, as mentioned previously. So now for another bit of context, I also want to talk about the outbreak of World War I and how that relates to the experiences of Indian soldiers. So in 1914, the world would see the outbreak of World War I within Europe. What started due to fast-paced militarization and buildup would explode into war of global scale. Britain was quick to mobilize its British Indian Army, moving to place Indian soldiers on French soil in 1914. Such a move would facilitate the rapid exchange of letters between Indian soldiers, as well as between Indian soldiers and their family members on the home front in India. Due to a desire to monitor troop morale, or what was most likely a result of colonial anxieties related to the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, the British would form a censorship bureau in Boulogne, France in 1914. The censorship would originally be limited to inward mails, as the British were said to be afraid of seditious letters reaching the hands of Indian troops. But such censorship would quickly be applied to outward mails as well, in order to keep news of the violence of trench warfare from what was seen to be a place of possible rebellion during the war in India. The censorship, due to these reasons above, was most certainly linked to a colonial desire to exert control in the face of a possible uprising. This is especially true when one considers the fact that English officials tried to hide this censorship from the Indian soldiers themselves. Yet despite this, The soldiers would eventually hear of this activity by early 1915, and such knowledge was reflected in the use of codes within the letters to hide information. While the use of the soldiers' letters must be conducted with care, as the source of these letters is the English colonial state and its censorship bureau, one can argue they were still valuable sources of information for scholars. During a time of intense war and colonial anxieties, the Indian soldiers who used codes were able to exercise personal agency via the written word, despite attempts by the colonial state to police such matters. In this context, the letters that follow stand as powerful reminders of the experiences of colonial soldiers on the Western Front between 1914 and 1916. Okay, so for more context on the photo that I've included here, so this photo here is titled Indian Infantry Digging Trenches, and it was taken by H.D. Girdwood in 1915. I thought it would be an important photo to include when discussing the Indian contribution to World War I, so that you might be able to visually see what life was like for many of the soldiers. Okay, so now we move on to our first letter. So the first letter we will be looking at is from a Pathan soldier written on February 4th, 1915, to an unnamed Defadar soldier. So let's now read the letter, and then I will provide some analysis after. So the first half of the letter, written in Urdu, states, "Such a time as this comes upon brave young men. In the bravery of youth you must not lose your spirit. Whatever is fated of God, that comes to pass." And then we see a switch to Pashto. "These words that I have written above, I have written only for this purpose, that any great folk open the letter, they may be pleased. So far as possible, look after your life and your brother's life. This is not such a war as warrants you taking unnecessary risks, and to preserve your life is your duty. This is my prayer, that God may bring you both home in safety." So specifically, when we look at this letter, it might not seem like a coded letter at first. Yet if we look closely, we can see how it is. The author starts off the first half of the letter in Urdu, and in this half he is urging the recipient to stay strong in the face of war. However, the author then switches to Pashto, and when he makes this switch, he also switches the meaning of the letter. In this second half, the author implores the recipient to look out for himself and to avoid risking his life. This is a telling switch for multiple reasons. To begin, at the start of the war, each unit was expected to have an officer who spoke the unit's language, in large part so they could aid in reading the unit's communications. However, the violence of war and the quick loss of officers meant that there was very much difficulty in replacing the old officers with new officers who understood the languages. And since that was the case, Urdu kind of became the lingua franca of the British Indian Army, according to David and Missy. By switching languages in the middle of the letter, the Pathan soldier is demonstrating his knowledge of this shortage of officers with language experience, hoping to use that to pass information that he does not want the British to hear. In the process, the Pathan soldier is also able to show his knowledge of British expectations. He himself says, "These words that I have written above, I have written only for this purpose, that if any great folk open the letter, they may be pleased." He knew that the British expected perseverance over personal safety to be emphasized, and he hoped that by highlighting strength in the one language he expected the British would read, he would also be able to pass along his true intentions in Pashto. Such a move is a powerful show of personal agency, using one's own cultural and language practices to maneuver around British colonial expectations. So here we see that the photo is also the cover of the source book I was using for this assignment. Indian Voices of the Great War by David and Missy is a valuable tool, and I have included it as a photo so that if you maybe look back on these letters and you also want to have access to them in the future, you can quickly find the information and search it in your local library. Right, so going on to the second letter. This letter was sent by Bugler Masa Ram, a Jat from the 107th Pioneers, to Naik Dabi Shahai Jat, who was a part of the 121st Pioneers. So again, we know little about Ram's identity, but this letter does still contain very interesting words that we can analyze to understand the sepoy experiences in World War I. So to start off, the letter is written in Hindi, and it reads, "The state of affairs here is as follows. The black pepper is finished. Now the red pepper is being used, but occasionally the black pepper proves useful. The black pepper is very pungent, and the red pepper is not so strong. This is a secret, but you are a wise man. Consider it with your understanding. There's no necessity for me to write more. And the black pepper, which I have with me, is very pungent. But what can I do? Only a little remains. In the foreign country nowadays, black pepper seems to be stopped. At this time red pepper is a little pungent, but compared to black pepper, it seems like insipid green vegetables. So what is interesting here is that upon a second glance, RAM is using code to communicate military intel, specifically in that black peppers, for the sake of this letter, actually is code for Indian soldiers, and red pepper is code for English soldiers. This is a fascinating letter for multiple reasons. For one, the English expressly forbade the communication of military intel, so right away Ram's decision to send this letter goes against the colonial state's wish to keep true strength secret. It also challenges previous views on the abilities of the Indian soldiers in the front. George Morton Jack writes that English officials thought that the sepoys were exceptionally inadequate in battle, were unable to stomach industrial warfare, and cowards who hid in trees, and that they were more likely to self-inflict hand wounds and flee the trenches to avoid serving. There was a general belief that these soldiers were not capable of exhibiting bravery on the battlefield. However, Ram disputes this when he says that, and the black pepper, which I have with me, is very pungent. But what can I do? Only a little remains. In the foreign country nowadays, black pepper seems to be stopped. At this time, red pepper is a little pungent, but compared to black pepper, it seems like insipid green vegetables. By describing the Indian soldiers as pungent, Ram is communicating to the recipient that the Indian soldiers are a strong force, and not only that, but a force that actually rivals and surpasses that of the English troops he works with. This would not have been a point Ram could have communicated out loud without facing a possibly violent response, but in his letters, he asserts his own agency in speaking his truth and counteracting popular biases against he and his fellow soldiers. We must be careful, as he may have overestimated the strength of his unit, but nevertheless, his letter acts as a useful counterpoint to the average scholarship on the capabilities of Indian soldiers on the front. Alright, so now we will move on to the next letter. So the next letter we have was written on August 25th, 1915 by Jemidar Ahmad Amir, who was a Afrindi to Naik Gupur of the 28th Punjabis. Since Amir is a Afrindi, we can make an educated guess that he was most likely from the Northwest Frontier Territories, and interestingly enough also fits within the English martial race theory mentioned earlier when we discussed the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. Since this letter has a lot of moving parts, I'm going to include a key to what each name stands for as I read it aloud, and please feel free to refer to it on screen as I read the letter for context. In Urdu, the author writes, "Please tell me anything fresh that might happen in the regiment, and think this over, and make an inquiry of Mir Gaul. If you do not understand, let us say that a letter came from our country, the NWFP, to me, and there has been fighting between the Mindin Kel and Kumbar Kel, and one Samat Ullah Khan of the Malik Din Kel has joined the Kumbar Kel. And if you know, then send me an answer, and if you do not know, then again send me an answer. And Lance Naik Samat Ullah Khan has been guilty of rank treachery and has disgraced the name of the 28th. Now there is a lot going on here. To understand what Amir means, we need to know that 1. Samat Ullah Khan is the individual in question guilty of desertion. 2. The Malik Din Kel is code for the British Army. And 3. Kumbar Kel is code for the German Army. So what Amir is basically saying is that he has heard that Samat Ullah Khan deserted the British Army in favor of the Germans. This is interesting because, like I said before, the British forbade the spread of military intel, so Amir is already disobeying a colonial order. Not only that, but he chooses to do so by using code that invokes the peasant imagery of his home. This makes sense when one considers that Heather Street Salter said that the British viewed these soldiers as rather slow but doggedly loyal. Simply put, the British thought Indian soldiers to be less intelligent than their English counterparts, and so traditional cultural discussions could be looked down upon as less intelligent as well. Fascinatingly enough, through his use of peasant tribal language, Amir is using the British stereotypes placed upon him against the British themselves, hoping that doing so will allow him to send information and ask for intel without the British looking into it too closely. This highlights just how aware many Indian soldiers might have been about how they were viewed, and for Amir, turning those stereotypes on their head is a radical show of written agency in which he turns the tables on the British reader. Okay, so the last letter we will be looking at was written by Ahmad Khan to Shamsher Ali Khan, a Punjabi Muslim from the 34th Pune Horse, on November 10, 1915. We have little information on Ahmad Khan, though it is likely that he might be related to Shamsher Ali Khan. We also must be careful when analyzing the following letter, as it is in Ahmad Khan's telling of what Shamsher Ali Khan had written in a previous letter, and therefore he may not have recounted what the original letter said with perfect accuracy. He writes that, what you say about the apples and pears makes my mouth water, but when one thinks that bombs are more plentiful than apples, and shells than pears, and that there are more bullets flying around than grapes, it makes one's hair stand on end. I am sure that, just as our Indians run to pick rare fruit like this, so they face fearlessly the messenger of death. If Ahmad Khan's retelling of Shamsher Ali Khan's letter is faithful to the original, we can actually learn a great deal about gender expectations in war. To start, any mention of fruit in this letter is actually a coded reference to white women, and so we can make an educated guess that Shamsher Ali Khan was talking about his or another man's relations with a white woman through the use of fruit as code in his original correspondence. While we must be careful when ascribing a radical nature to any of these letters, this definitely seems so, in large part because, as David and Missy writes, Indian soldiers having sexual relations with white women could strike very raw British nerve endings, which often resulted in violent responses. Despite that, Shamsher Ali Khan still chose to risk communicating his activities to Ahmad Khan, which is a show of personal written agency in which he asserts his wartime experiences existed, even if the British wanted to pretend they didn't. The British most likely had strong feelings about this because, as part of the colonial building language that sprung up around the time of the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, according to Radhika Monoram, British men believed that whiteness was retroactively conferred upon women due to their heterosexual relationships with white men, and that under the context of the expanding empire, men expected English women to be the angel in the house. Simply put, what made an English woman white was her relationship with a white man. If an Indian soldier pursued a relationship with a white woman, he could be seen as threatening the English empire's stability. Despite this, Shamsher Ali Khan still sent his original letter in code, which means he knew he was challenging the social norm, but that did not stop him from composing the letter anyways. When Ahmad Khan writes that bombs are more plentiful than apples, he is unknowingly recommitting to words Shamsher Ali Khan's defiant and agency-filled stance against the colonial and empire-building anxieties of the British. So the last location and event I want to focus on is a current event that is kind of connected to my discussion on the Sepoy soldiers, and specifically I want to talk about it and what it says about how we should be approaching that event today in the present day. So my current event is related to Kenyan lawyers submitting complaint to the UN in relation to the forced removal of the Kipsigis and the Talai by the British Army in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So, beginning in 1902, Britain used the Crown Land Ordinance to forcibly take 90,000 acres of ancestral land from the Kipsigis and Talai in Kericho and Bomet counties in Kenya, all of which would be divided into farms to be used by European settlers. This was done in large part once British settlers realized the land in the counties would be perfect for tea plant cultivation. Those Kenyans who were removed were relocated to Gowasi, which is an unsafe location for human settlement due to its large number of lions and other predatory animals. From 1895 to 1963, various waves of forced resettlement led to gross human rights violations, rape, and mistreatment of Kenyans at the hands of British officials. For years now, groups of Kipsigis and Talai have taken their hope for justice to the UK courts, which have had a track record of refusing to acknowledge such claims. Since this is the case, those who have been wronged have moved to notify the United Nations of the current issue. As of now, we must wait to see what comes of the United Nations involvement, but this event can easily be related back to the themes of English colonial anxiety present in the story of the Indian soldiers during World War I. English involvement in India was also economically motivated, and it too resulted in violent pushback and uprisings. Looking to the experiences of the Sepoy soldiers before, during, and after World War I, one can use that knowledge to argue that there is a clear pattern of past colonial wrongs committed by Britain. Perhaps it is time the nation commits to fully acknowledging this pattern, work to admit the wrongs committed against groups like the Kipsigis and the Talai, and offer what compensation will be needed in order to begin the healing process, if possible. So basically, the corresponding photo to this location is said to be a group of Kenyan protesters in 2011 in London. So they are protesting in memory of the Mau Mau uprising, which was a violent uprising that occurred in the 1950s that resulted in the torture and abuse of thousands of Kenyans. This is the end of my TimeMapper. I hope you enjoyed it. There will be a corresponding document with footnotes ordered by location, and within each location, order of what sources I spoke about. If you have any questions about where I got information, I highly suggest looking through that. Thank you again for your time, and have a lovely day.